So, how is it in Australia, sir?
Everything beautiful. We've had a gorgeous blue skies day, 75 Fahrenheit, 22 Celsius. I was out in the botanic gardens. I can send you photos.
Ah, yeah, botanic gardens, that's great.
Yeah, Sydney has wonderful botanic gardens, and that's where I went for the afternoon.
Ah, I see.
So it's been a beautiful day.
Oh. You came from America, right?
I am American. I've lived in Australia for 13 years.
Oh,
So Sydney has become home. But yes, I'm born in New Jersey. My family's from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins, which is in Baltimore, Maryland.
ah, John Hopkins, yeah. Is it, how is it in America? I see almost every day they are shooting in several places.
You know as good as I do, because I have not been home in a year and a half because of coronavirus. So all I know about America is what I see on TV.
Oh. Okay. Maybe. So, wait, let me ask again. Let me remind my friend to join, if they have to join.
Sure.
Uh,
The only place I've been in Indonesia is Bali. I guess everyone's been to Bali.
oh, you've been to Bali?
Yeah.
How do
Everyone
you
in
think Bali?
Australia has been to Bali.
Oh,
It was very nice to visit. The best part was the music. The music was really incredible. Our hotel had different traditional music every night, so that was fantastic.
okay. Yeah, it's like almost the only thing they know about Indonesia was Bali, but yet it is very impressive there. Okay. So, may I begin, sir?
All yours.
Okay. Good afternoon from Indonesia, Professor Babones. We from Madat Club, Komunitas Madani and Club Seri Buku want to thank you for taking your time to have discussion with us. I hope we are not bothering you, sir. May I introduce you to the audience? Okay.
I'm all yours. All yours.
Oke. Kawan-kawan yang sudah hadir, saya berterima kasih. Di sini bersama kita telah ada Profesor Babones. Sekilas saya akan menjelaskan tentang Profesor Babones. Beliau meraih gelar S1-nya di Universitas Montevallo tahun 1991, lalu mendapatkan gelar MSc di bidang matematika terapan di Universitas Johns Hopkins pada 2002 dan menerima gelar PhD dari Universitas Johns Hopkins juga. Nah, karir akademisnya sekarang adalah Profesor Sosiologi dan Kebijakan Sosial di Universitas Sydney, Australia. Selain itu, Pak Babones pernah menjadi Profesor Sosiologi di Universitas Pittsburgh, Amerika Serikat pada tahun 2008. Ia juga pernah menjadi Profesor Tamu di Nanyang Technological University di Singapura pada tahun 2015 dan Visiting Scholar di Akademia Sinica di Taipei pada tahun 2015 juga. Nah, beliau juga adalah penulis yang cukup produktif, beberapa tulisannya, diantaranya adalah International Structure of Income, Its Implication for Economic Growth, yang terbit pada tahun 2009, The Future of Development, A Radical Manifesto, terbit tahun 2014, Methods for Quantitative Micro Comparative Research, terbit tahun 2014. Nah, ini cocok untuk yang kajian ilmu perbandingan. Nah, yang keempat adalah 16 for 16, A Progressive Agenda for a Better America, terbit tahun 2015. Bricks or Bust, Escaping the Middle Income Trap, terbit tahun 2017. Ini kajian yang cukup menarik, ini Middle Income Trap. Nah, yang keenam adalah American Tianxia, Chinese Money, American Power, and the End of History, yang terbit pada tahun 2017. Dan yang paling mutakhir adalah The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism, and Tyranny of Experts, yang terbit tahun 2018 dan menjadi buku Best on Politics tahun 2018 menurut Wall Street Journal. Apparently, sir, your book, The New Authoritarianism, is quite famous lately. Several academics in Universitas Erlangga, we got Erlangga Pribadi, they quoted from it. Would you mind to explain to us what is the book about, sir?
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I'm very surprised to hear the book quoted in Indonesia because the book is entirely about the United States. It's actually quite a love letter from me to my home country. There's a little bit about Europe in it, but unlike most of my academic research, which focuses on Asia, the book is very US focused. And I wrote the book because I got tired of hearing Donald Trump called an authoritarian. As I pointed out to everybody, you can't be an authoritarian when the only authority you recognize is yourself. Now, Donald Trump could be called an egotist. You could even call him a dictator if you want, but you can't call him an authoritarian because the whole point of authoritarianism is that governing by reference to authority. And Donald Trump, of all American presidents, had perhaps the least authority, the least traditional authority to govern. People tend to use words like authoritarianism, totalitarianism, populism as generic political insults. If you don't like somebody, you call them one of these words. But these words actually have meanings, and I think it's useful to know what they mean, to use them in their historical senses. So, for example, authoritarianism as a term first appeared in the 1860s in the United States and in the United Kingdom. It arose in the spiritualist movement. At that time, in the US and UK, there was a movement of people who did not want to join traditional churches, but instead wanted to explore the spiritual life without belonging to a church. And one of the most famous of these, a little bit later, is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Doyle was a big fan of spiritualism. He would go to seances where they attempted to contact the dead. They would try to find ghosts. They were trying to access the spiritual world in defiance of the authority of the religion of their time. And so they actually called these standard religions, religions that based on a book or based on a preacher, as being authoritarian religions. And they would have called Catholicism or Anglicanism or Baptists in the United States, they would refer to all of these as authoritarian religions, because when you went to church, instead of saying that you found God by yourself, you heard about God from a book, the Bible, or you heard about God from a preacher, a priest, or a person in front of the room. And they insisted that these were authoritarian religions, instead of religions where you developed your own relationship with God. Later on, it was anarchists in the United States, people who wanted no government at all, who said that it was authoritarian when governments told people how they should behave. And they were specifically upset by governments that set hours for bars bars serving alcohol, they wanted to close them at 10 o'clock at night. And the anarchists said, that's authoritarian. It's an unfair imposition. Just because you're a priest or a preacher, it doesn't mean you can close down our saloon. So this was the second use of authoritarianism, but again, tied to religion. The early uses of authoritarianism were always about authoritarian religion. The first political uses actually come from the 1920s and 30s, describing the Salazar regime in Portugal, and then later the Franco regime in Spain. Both were referred to as authoritarian because Salazar and Franco said that they were legitimate rulers, not because of a constitution or an election. They were legitimate rulers because the church and the army and the police all supported them in power. In other words, the leading authorities in the country all supported these regimes. And the people who opposed them were populists or were anarchists or people who were not accepting the rule of the church and the state institutions. And from that time on, authoritarianism traditionally has been connected with people who have the support of the religious authorities and the security services. So, for example, somebody like Putin in Russia, Vladimir Putin, very much an authoritarian. In Hungary, I'm just going to forget his name, the president of Hungary, who again relies on the support of the Catholic Church and the security services. Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, again, a form of authoritarian rule. Now, Donald Trump, when he came to power, was condemned by just about every mainstream religion. He was supported by evangelicals, that is, people who were wanting to charismatically embrace their own religion, but he was condemned by mainstream religious leaders and absolutely condemned by the security services. I mean, the FBI tried to get Donald Trump out of power. So he did not have the support of the authorities in American society. Virtually every major source of authority condemned Donald Trump. So the old authoritarians, like Putin, like Erdogan, like the Ayatollahs in Iran, they are very different from what we saw with Donald Trump in the United States. Now, another term that is widely misused is totalitarianism. A lot of people think that, authoritarian is bad. If you don't like a government, you call it authoritarian. And if a government is really bad, you call it totalitarian. So Hitler and Stalin were totalitarians, while Xi Jinping is simply an authoritarian. And again, that's entirely wrong. A government that exists with no legitimate authority, that exists on pure power, is a totalitarian regime. And that's, again, using the definition of totalitarianism that goes back to Luigi Sturzo, who was the Italian theorist who first coined the term, or Hannah Arendt, the famous political philosopher who wrote about authoritarianism in Germany during World War II. I'm sorry, I confused my own terms. Who wrote about totalitarianism in Germany during World War II. These scholars saw totalitarianism as a form of total control of society through the sheer power of the state. Well, that's what we have in today's China. Today's China doesn't rest on the authority of Confucianism or the authority of any particular religion. It rests on the pure power of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party to dominate every institution in Chinese society. To put it differently, authoritarianism is a form of legitimacy. It's different from democratic legitimacy. Democratic legitimacy means we had an election, whoever was elected, we've all agreed will abide by the laws set by the people we've elected. That's one form of legitimacy. Another form of legitimacy is the church or the religious authorities know what's best for the country, and so they support a leader. In Iran, the religious authorities control all power in Iran. In Russia, Putin, it's not, he's supported by the religious authorities, but it's the security services in Russia, the KGB, from which Putin emerged, telling people, no, trust us. We know what's best for the country. We've put this person in power. So authoritarianism requires this kind of institutional basis, and that makes it a legitimate form of government. Now, remember, when I say legitimate, I'm not saying it's a moral form of government. It's a fair form of government. I'm not saying it's a right form of government. I'm not endorsing it. I'm saying that it rests on a solid social foundation, meaning that even if you removed one particular leader from power or changed something, the government would go on, because the government in Iran is not based on the identity of, well, formerly Ayatollah Khomeini. But when he died, well, fine, new Ayatollah Khomeini comes into power. Because the legitimacy of the government is based on the authority of these institutions that are accepted by at least a large portion of the population. Now, I think in China, Xi Jinping is not particularly accepted by any particular authority in China except his own. That is, he rules based on his own power. That makes him a totalitarian, not an authoritarian. And totalitarianism is not a form of legitimacy. Totalitarianism is a form of government simply based on power. And it's not just him. In Taiwan, for example, before the transition to democracy, Chiang Kai-shek was a totalitarian leader. His nationalist party infiltrated all institutions in Taiwanese society and murdered anybody who opposed him. He wasn't ruling based on any kind of real legitimacy. He was ruling because he had the guns. As Mao Zedong said, power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Well, that's a very totalitarian way of thinking about government. Now, populism is something different entirely. And my most recent book, The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts, is fundamentally about American populism. Populism simply means faith in the ordinary person. The original populist movement in the United States was in the 1890s. It was led by a famous figure called William Jennings Bryan. Bryant was called the great commoner, meaning the great ordinary person. People followed Bryan because they thought he's an ordinary farmer just like us, and he was saying, don't trust the authorities in Washington, don't trust the banks in New York, you should have faith in the common person, and the ordinary person should be running this country. Now, Bryan later joined the Democratic Party. He's viewed as a progressive in American politics, or I should say, he was viewed as a progressive in American politics until recently. And thus, you could try to call him some kind of left-wing populism. But I don't think right and left really apply here. So, for example, William Jennings Bryan was also extremely religious. In fact, there was a famous trial in the United States called the Scopes trial, also known as the Monkey trial, which was a trial in which a teacher was prosecuted for teaching evolution in his biology class. So this was, in the 1920s. The teacher was teaching people Darwin's theory of evolution. The state of Kentucky prosecuted him. And who did they get to prosecute him? William Jennings Bryan. That is this great populist leader. Now, if you call him a left-wing populist, well, but he's also insisting that the world was created in 7 days by God, and nobody can question that. So is that a left-wing view or is that a right-wing view? I think populism doesn't really have wings, and that's the problem. And so on to Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump was clearly a populist. He questioned the established authorities in society. Now, unlike the old William Jennings Bryan, Trump was a Republican, but Trump is not particularly religious. He's not particularly conservative in most ways. He wanted tax cuts for rich people, but there's nothing really culturally conservative about tax cuts for rich people. The other Republicans during the Republican primaries in 2016 challenged Trump for not being a real conservative. Yet, once he got the nomination, of course, he took on standard Republican Party policies. And so you could call him a right-wing populist. But again, I think just like William Jennings Bryan a century earlier, there's not really any such thing as a right-wing or a left-wing populist. What a populist is someone who insists, don't trust those authorities at Harvard University, don't trust the authorities on Wall Street, don't trust the authorities in the Capitol in Washington, don't trust what people tell you, rely on your own ability to seek information. Trump was supported, of course, by Breitbart. Breitbart was the website created by, I'm terrible with names. If I don't write them down, I forget them. Most of you will know who created Breitbart. And Breitbart, was saying, don't trust the New York Times, don't trust the Washington Post. We on this online website will give you ideas. So Trump was a populist first and foremost. Was he more conservative than liberal? Yes, definitely. And so if you want to call that right-wing populism, you can, but it's much more confused than that. I think a lot of Americans were what we call the Sanders-Trump crossover voters. People who voted for Bernie Sanders because he was a left-wing populist, who then voted for Donald Trump because he was a right-wing populist. And of course, they weren't voting for Sanders or Trump because they were left or right. They were really just populists. What they wanted was to get government out of the hands of the elite and put it in the hands of ordinary people. So if you think about it in that context, think about the complaints leveled against the Trump administration in office. Many of the complaints were that the people running policy were very amateur, that there was no professionalism in the construction of policies during the Trump administration. Well, that's true because Trump brought in a lot of amateurs. That is, a lot of more ordinary people who are not part of the intellectual establishment into running the country. He did not rely on standard conservative Republicans to come staff his administration. Instead, he brought in, I just remembered the name, his chief of staff, Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon had been the person who invented Breitbart, who published Breitbart. He brought in lots of people who did not have the usual approach to doing business. And that's why the Trump administration's policies, for example, on China, broke with 20 years of US policy on China, suddenly a whole new approach. Now, is Trump confronting China right-wing or left-wing? Really, it's neither. It's very populist. Similarly, Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Is that left-wing or right-wing? I mean, on the one hand, liberals like the environment. On the other hand, lots of factory workers didn't want the Paris Accord because they thought it would hurt factory jobs in America. So again, what's left or right-wing? But it was certainly very populist to pull out of the Paris Accord. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which again was an agreement among the entire elite class of the United States, but it was very much attacked by populists in America. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump promised to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a very populist agenda, not particularly a left or a right-wing agenda. Now, what we've had with the election of Joe Biden has been something of a return to normalcy in American politics. Joe Biden hasn't appointed a bunch of super left-wing populists to his administration. He has brought in the usual experts from the Brookings Institution, from Goldman Sachs, from a lot of the top establishment places, the Council on Foreign Relations. These are the people who've staffed his administration. He's brought in professionals. So it's a return to normalcy in American politics. And it is what I call in my book. Now, the book's not about Biden. The book was written in 2015. Sorry, in 2017, sorry. The book was written in 2017 about the 2016 election. But it is a return to what I call in the title of the book, the new authoritarianism. Now, if the old authoritarianism was based on the authority of church and the authority of religion and the authority of security services, the new authoritarianism is based on the authority of think tanks, the authority of Wall Street, the authority of the top leadership of corporations. That's what I've called in the book the new authoritarianism. And it's not the same as traditional authoritarianism, but it is still based on that same idea that you should leave government to the adults, to the professionals, to the people who have trained their whole lives to be in government, instead of opening up government to non-professionals, to amateurs, to ordinary people. So what I call in the title of the book, the new authoritarianism, is very much the kind of group that Biden has brought back into power. Now, again, that's a legitimate form of governance. And I'm very wary because I'm a social scientist. I'm not a political activist. When I call something authoritarian, I'm not condemning it. And I actually say in the book, if you want good policy, turn to the established authorities. I strongly suspect that the Biden administration will give us better social and political and economic policies than the Trump administration. But if you want democracy, turn to populism, not authoritarianism. That is, democracy will often give you leaders who are idiots, who are loudmouths, who are poorly trained. Because, of course, in a democracy, we can vote for anyone we want, right? And that doesn't necessarily get you good policy. There's this kind of myth in American political science that, oh, democracy always produces the best outcomes. No, democracy can produce terrible outcomes, but at least they're democratic outcomes. And they base their legitimacy on being democratic, not on being right. If you want to base your legitimacy on being right, on being well-trained, on being professional, that's a form of authoritarianism, a new form of authoritarianism. If you base your legitimacy on more people voted for me, well, then you're a populist, but you're also a Democrat. And the interesting thing about Donald Trump is he came out of a world, reality television, which is full of elections. Reality television is full of people calling up the show to say who they want to keep on the show or kick off the show. Well, that's very democratic in spirit. That's very different from, say, the scripted world of Joe Biden, where Joe Biden, I think, is much more comfortable in the world of speeches with a teleprompter in front of him, being very adult and professional. So the new authoritarianism versus the new populism. I'll leave it there. Love to take questions and have a discussion about this. And I do have to say right off the bat, I know nothing about Indonesian politics. So if you want to talk Indonesian politics, you'll have to bring your insights, not ask me for mine.
Thank you very much for your explanation and information, Mr. Babones. Maybe there is some kind of question for my friend, Mas Sulhan. Here, he asked, what is the position of populism in a democratic country? And about Bernie Sanders, is it possible for a progressive figure like him to win? And what is the position of a thinker like Chomsky in American politics? That's it.
Those are three questions. The first one, as far as I'm concerned, populism is the very heart of democracy. Now, political scientists don't like to hear that because, as I said, populism often gives very poor policies. You can't guarantee that people will vote for things that are actually good for them. But if you have the attitude, I want people to get what's good for them, That's not fundamentally democratic. That goes back to Plato. Plato's Republic said the people in charge should be the philosophers, the people who've spent their whole lives training to be in charge. Well, populism says exactly the opposite. No, people get whatever they want. As H.L. Mencken put it, the famous American pundit in the 1920s, he said, democracy is the theory that people get what they want and they get it good and hard, meaning that they get what they want and we're going to push it down their throats whether they like it or not. Now, Mencken was an anti-democrat, but I think he gets the idea right, that democracy is the idea that people vote and they get what they voted for. Populism is very much part of that. Populism brings people into the political process. It tells people, you may not have a university degree. You may not even know how to read and write, but you're still in charge. Your opinion matters. And I ask people like us, because all of us are university educated, or most of us are, we're sophisticated thinkers. We'd like to think we're intellectuals. And if I were to ask you, should an uneducated homeless person get to vote? Well, if you're a Democrat, yeah, obviously. Should the uneducated homeless person have the same vote as you? Well, if you believe in democracy, the answer is yes. Populism is trying to go out and get those people into the political process. And in 2018 and 2020, that's what we saw in the United States, record political turnout. And I attribute that to populism. Could a Bernie Sanders get elected? Sure, he could. He almost did. I mean, I think that had Bernie Sanders beaten Hillary Clinton, he would have beaten Donald Trump. I think Trump only succeeded because the Democratic Party establishment forced a candidate like Hillary Clinton onto the party. And I think the same thing happened in 2020. I actually really thought Trump would win in 2020. I'm certain the only reason he didn't win, well, I'd say there are two reasons he didn't win. He handled the coronavirus crisis very poorly. Let's face it, he just didn't handle it well. And they changed the voting rules. Now, we're still having lawsuits in the US where these changes in voting rules legal. But had the 2020 election occurred under the same rules that were in place a year previously, if nobody had changed the rules because of coronavirus, he probably would have won the 2020 election against Joe Biden, who was another candidate forced on the Democratic Party by the establishment. So in both 2016 and 2020, the Democratic Party establishment insisted it would not go down the populist route. There were populists running on the Democratic side in both 2016, Bernie Sanders, and in 2020, Bernie Sanders, but also several other populists running in 2020. Both times, the Democratic Party establishment quashed that. They used the entire weight of the party establishment to crush these candidates and promote a candidate. And despite running against somebody as, I mean, let's face it, whether you like or dislike Trump, somebody as unsympathetic as Donald Trump. I mean, nobody likes Donald Trump. Even Donald Trump's supporters don't like Donald Trump. They may like what he does, but they find him, uncouth, disreputable, not a nice person. I mean, you won't find anyone in America, very few people in America actually saying, oh, I really like Donald Trump. Despite running against somebody so unsympathetic as Donald Trump, both Clinton and Joe Biden struggled to win. Had the Democratic Party endorsed someone like Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg, was very much a populist person in the 2020 elections, I think they would have crushed Donald Trump. That is, I think had there been a real populist Democrat, they would have easily won the election. Now, Noam Chomsky's a difficult figure. Chomsky is, I think, a wonderful man. He, despite being so incredibly famous and polarizing and a real intellectual celebrity, he actually answers email. When I've emailed him, he's written back. Now he's written back to tell me, oh, I'm really, Salvatore, thanks for writing. I'm really sorry. I have so many calls on my time. I just can't give you comments on what. Fair enough. I mean, thousands of people every day, I'm sure, write to Noam Chomsky, but he answers, right? And I really respect that. So Noam Chomsky is a divisive figure, but I think a very reputable one in my view. And I've emphasized how moral he is, because I do disagree vehemently with many of Chomsky's ways of thinking, in that Chomsky, although I share a lot of his policy positions, Chomsky throughout his career has been a revolutionary Marxist who has, at least in his writing, I mean, I don't know how he feels as a person, but in his writing, he does seem sympathetic to the idea of the violent overthrow of a government, as long as it puts in good policies as a result. And although I agree with him on the policies, I vehemently disagree with the idea of violently overthrowing an elected government just because the people have made the wrong choice. And I don't think, I think in a democracy, it's incumbent on all of us to accept that, well, I don't have to agree with what the people chose. People make the wrong choice all the time. But I still have to respect that choice. I mean, unless that choice is genocidal, unless that choice is, it produces such a moral dilemma at Hitlerian levels, you have to respect democracy.
Okay, thank you for your answer, sir. So I think there are a lot of questions here, sir. Okay. The second one, there is a question from the audience, Mr. Yofi. He's asking, why is Margaret Thatcher's Great Britain rarely became the best example of authoritarian rule in the 20th century? Because I caught at the time.
Why is who? Sorry, I didn't catch the question. You start over again?
Why is Margaret Thatcher's Great Britain rarely became the best example of authoritarian rule in the 20th century? Margaret Thatcher.
I'm not quite understanding. Saying Margaret Thatcher is an authoritarian? Again, I think Margaret Thatcher. So I want to encourage people to use these words advisedly, and not call someone authoritarian just because you disagree with her. Margaret Thatcher is you could say that she was very aggressive. She was very conservative. She was very nationalistic. These are all appropriate words to apply to Margaret Thatcher. Neoliberal. But Margaret Thatcher challenged the authorities in England of her time. The authorities in England of her time that were respected, the established institutions, were the labor unions, the Church of England, the monarchy to some extent, the landowners. She was a firebrand who wanted to forget what all the establishment says. I want to do something else. That's not an authoritarian. I mean, now again, I'm not saying you can't dislike Margaret Thatcher. I'm saying dislike her in appropriate ways. That is, dislike her for who she was, not for someone she wasn't. So I don't think Margaret Thatcher was an authoritarian at all. She was many outspoken things, but not an authoritarian.
Okay, thank you. So actually, there is this addition, sir. So he asked why Margaret Thatcher, because he said that he got at the time that there was a lot of restraint against the worker, plus the inclusion of mass media. That's why they are calling him authoritarian.
Yeah, and a lot of people would use that word for Margaret Thatcher. It doesn't mean it's the right word. I mean, why is opposing workers authoritarian? I mean, there's nothing about the word authoritarianism that has to do with workers, other than simply using authoritarian as a generic insult, right? And I don't think we should use words like authoritarian, totalitarian, communist, socialist. I don't think we should use these just as generic insults, and both sides do it. I mean, Donald Trump was calling everyone a socialist all the time. Now, there are very few socialists in America. I mean, Bernie Sanders is one, but very few socialists in America. Well, let's not call it, he shouldn't call everyone he disagrees with a socialist, and people who oppose Margaret Thatcher or oppose conservatives, call her a conservative. Say, oh, Margaret Thatcher was a nationalist arch-conservative. She was a nationalist, arch-conservative, neoliberal. Absolutely. Authoritarian? No, I mean, she didn't. She challenged authority. And no one who challenges authority is an authoritarian.
Oke, thank you. Untuk kawan-kawan, ini lumayan banyak ini pertanyaannya. Berhubung Mas Ramadan sudah angkat tangan, monggo Mas Ramadan. Habis itu Mas Pira, siapa ini? Mas Piran dan Mas Yusuf. Habis itu ya saya sampaikan. Monggo Mas Ramadan.
Makasih waktunya, Mas. Excuse me, sir. I have some question for you. First, how is the relationship between populism in American and the theory of identity politics proposed by Francisco Fukuyama? And second, maybe this question is a little out of the context. Will populism in America have an impact on America's geopolitical decisions?
Will it have an impact on what? Sorry.
Sorry.
The second question. Will populism have an effect on what?
Yeah. Will populism in America have an impact on America's geopolitical decisions?
Oh, okay. Geopolitics. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Identity politics is something that people think is new in America, and in fact, it's actually very old. What's new are the identities who are claiming political recognition. Fukuyama sees identity politics as undermining democracy, and sorry, we have to. Yeah, that's better. Fukuyama sees identity politics undermining democracy, and it does undermine democracy if people take it seriously. And I suspect that political theorists take identity politics much more seriously than ordinary people. So let me put this in a more practical context. Democracy works by majority rule, and majority rule only makes sense if we have lots of overlapping interest groups. So if I say that we have majority rule, and in India there's a lot of debate about Hindus and Muslims, and that if all the Hindus vote on one side, then they can rule over all the Muslims. And so identity politics is a real problem. If people are voting because they're Hindu or because they're Muslim for a particular party, well, then identity politics are really a serious problem, because it leads to this permanent minority who gets ruled over by a permanent majority. But in most democratic countries, I think even including India, but especially in the United States, although you might be Black or woman or Muslim or some other thing, you're also a homeowner or a renter. You're also a high-income person or low-income person. You're also a retiree who needs Social Security benefits, or a taxpayer who wants lower taxes. You're also either a parent who cares about education for your children, or not a parent and you don't care about educational issues. You're also either religious or not religious. If you're religious, you're either Christian or Muslim. So if I take any one identity, for example, homosexual identity. Homosexual identity is very important for people who are homosexual. But does that mean they always vote on the basis of homosexual identity? I mean, kind of a simplistic view of politics is that they do. The homosexuals will vote Democrat, the blacks will vote Democrat, the whites will vote Republican, the Christians will vote Republican. All right, which way does a white Christian homosexual vote? Not clear, right? And what about a black homosexual rich person who wants a tax cut? Is that person a Democrat or a Republican? Well, see, now we have a problem. And I think identity politics is not as threatening as Fukuyama says or believes, because everyone has multiple identities. Now, if you get into situations like India before partition, India in 1947, there were the only identity that mattered was religion. Either you're Hindu or Muslim or Sikh, and that's going to determine your family's survival, because Hindus are attacking Muslims, Muslims are attacking Sikhs. But those situations are rare in the world, and they certainly don't apply in multifaceted countries like the United States, which is mainly what Fukuyama is studying. In the US, yes, there's lots of identity politics, but if I were a gay leader saying all gay people must vote for the way I say because they're gay, well, that would get me in a lot of trouble, because people would say, well, yeah, okay, maybe I'm gay, but I'm also something else. And that's why Joe Biden got in so much trouble during the election, when he said that if you're black, you have to vote Democrat. If you don't vote Democrat, you're not a real black, not a real African American. And that got him a lot of political trouble, ridiculed, really criticized, because of course, being black doesn't mean you have to vote Democrat. The reason so many blacks vote Democratic is that they're not only black, they tend to be poor, they tend to live in cities. So all of their multiple identities tend to line up on the Democratic Party side. It's not some kind of automatic, because of your skin color, you have to vote for a certain party. It doesn't override other people's identities. And that's why there are many prominent black Republicans in the United States. But those black Republicans tend to be rich, successful, top-level doctors, top-level business people. That is, their other identities matter more than their black identity. There are lots of gay Republicans, but again, they tend to be richer. They tend to be, often if they're Christian and gay, that is, other identities prevail over their identities. So I think Fukuyama tries to be very fashionable. His books are always at the hot topic of the day. But I think on identity politics, what he gets wrong, what many political analysts get wrong, is that they divide populations into these neat categories without realizing that the whole reason democracy works is that these categories overlap. That's why we never have the problem of the tyranny of the majority. When John Adams, one of the US founding fathers, wrote a book on the Constitution of the United States, his big warning was the tyranny of the majority. His big warning was that 60% of the people would get together and vote to take all the money away from the other 40% of the people. And in more than 200 years of American history, that's never happened. Why? Because although you may be part of this group for some purposes, you're part of another group for other purposes. So it's not just that nobody's ever inside or outside power. It's only politicians who think in terms of, I'm a Democrat, I'm in power. When someone else is in power, then the other side's in power. For most ordinary people, well, yeah, I like Donald Trump because he gave me a tax cut, but I like Joe Biden because he's going to improve the economy. That is, most ordinary people are getting something they want from every president. They're not wholly on one side or the other. I spent a lot of time on that. Very quickly, does populism undermine American geopolitics? I don't think so. Of course, anti-populists say so, that it makes American foreign policy more difficult. But then again, more authoritarian or more professional management also alienates people. It just alienates different people. So Donald Trump alienated some American allies, but appealed to others. In the same way, the Biden administration is going to alienate many people. Right now, he's in a honeymoon period. He's saying we're going to work with all of our friends and allies, but inevitably he's going to alienate people. I always remind people that even before the populist wave of 2016, George Bush was incredibly unpopular among Europeans. There were protests in Europe whenever George Bush visited. Ronald Reagan was incredibly unpopular among Europeans. So thinking about how America is perceived in the world based on protests against the president, I think really is not an effective way to think about foreign policy. Bill Clinton, when he went to the G7 and G8 summits, had mass protests against globalization. There was this big Seattle anti-globalization protest against Bill Clinton's policies in 1999 that got a lot of global attention. There was a global anti-globalization movement against Bill Clinton. Whoever's president is going to have people against him, and I don't think populism really probably matters very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. There are another 3 questions, but I'm gonna ask it by one. So the other question was from Yusuf Habibi. He said that I think the wings in populism are used to identify movements and masses. So I think these wings are important too. And is this what you call populist is good for democracy, but maybe bad for policy? Yeah.
Well, the right and left wing are terms that people find useful usually for criticizing their opponents. That is, I've never met anybody, maybe never met anybody who said, I'm left wing or I'm right wing. The people who get accused of being left wing, well, they always say, no, I'm a moderate. It's my opponents who are right wing. And of course, people get accused of being right wing say, no, I'm a moderate. It's the others who are left wing. So I'm not sure how good right and left wing are for characterizing people. But I do think, as Yusuf suggests, it is useful for democracy in that it helps create sense of the political space. That is, people it helps people put labels on things that can then help them decide where they want to fit in their voting. So is it positive for democracy to have left and right wings? Yeah, probably. Now again, I think extremism is always a problem. But so let's leave out of this violent movements. I'm opposed to violent movements of all kinds, whether they call themselves left wing, right wing, you name it. But if we're just talking populism, trying to get people excited about politics, ordinary people, yeah, I do think it's a positive, whether it's left or right wing, quote unquote. It's good for democracy to get people involved in politics.
Okay. There is another question from my friend Piran here. Does the understanding of authoritarian God or benevolent God in religion affect democracy in America? Or how much influence has religion teachings on authoritarianism or democracy in America, sir?
Classically, religious authoritarianism has been a characteristic of countries where there's a single state religion. So in Spain and Portugal, there was Catholic-based authoritarianism. In Russia, it was Orthodox-based authoritarianism. In Greece, after World War II, there was a very Greek Orthodox-based authoritarianism in Greece, where the dictators in Greece ruled with the support of the Greek Orthodox Church, forced everyone to go to church. In Iran, where there's one major religious group. I mean, I know there are religious minorities in Iran, but where Shia Muslims and the Shia establishment control Iran, then again, there's authoritarianism based on that. America has never really had religious-based authoritarianism because there are just so many different religions that if you don't like what your priest says at your Catholic church, just go over to the Presbyterians. You don't like what the Presbyterians are saying, I'll just go over to the Lutherans or go over to the Baptists. My mother's a good example. My mother was born Catholic. She later became Lutheran. She went to a Baptist church for a while. She now goes to a Dutch Reformed church. She's been religious all along, but if she doesn't like what a church says, she goes to another church. And even before the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, wrote about this in Philadelphia in the 1750s, saying that, if people thought if a pastor or a priest at one church was becoming very authoritarian, telling people what to think, I want you to do this, you can't do that, people would just leave his church and go to a different church. And so for America, religious-based authoritarianism has never taken hold as a political movement, just because there's no religion that is widely accepted among the American public as the true religion. Again, authoritarianism doesn't just require me to proclaim I'm an authority. It requires other people to accept that I'm an authority. And with such a fractured religious basis in the United States, it's hard for any religion to get that kind of authority of being in charge. I will say there's one exception. In Utah, there has been something like a Mormon authoritarianism. It's very hard to get elected in Utah if you're not supported by the Mormon church. You don't have to be a Mormon, but the Mormon church has to support you. And if they don't, you can't get office. So there is a kind of Mormon authoritarianism locally in Utah, but that doesn't really exist in any other state in America.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Another question. I see that you are also focusing on China. So there is this question about China.
Okay.
How's about the China's domination in Africa continent, especially in Djibouti and Ethiopia under BRI during this COVID era?
Yeah, I just actually published an article about China in Ethiopia, so that's a timely question. My academic research actually does not focus on politics. My politics writing is popular writing. It's focused on a popular audience. My actual academic research is on Chinese influence in the world. China has bought its way to influence in Africa with heavy subsidies. In Ethiopia, of course, it built the African Union building. It built a railway. It built Addis Ababa's mass transit. It's been building infrastructure all over Ethiopia. And then 2 years ago, the Tigrayans who ran Ethiopia had essentially a coup against them, a political coup inside a parliamentary coup inside parliament, but still effectively a coup. And now there's a civil war in Ethiopia. The China-supported faction in Ethiopia, the Tigrayans, are now on the losing side of this civil war in Ethiopia. So I expect China to have a lot more problems in Ethiopia now that the government has changed. And that's been the problem for China throughout its efforts to have influence across the developing world. Much closer than Ethiopia, you saw exactly the same thing play out in Malaysia, where a government that was very close to China became unpopular. What happened? The government was overthrown. New government is much more anti-China, and suddenly all that money and effort China spent to build influence in Malaysia disappeared. Right? And so I think that's the problem with China's approach to buying political friends in the developing world, that as soon as the government changes, Chinese influence is gone. And I will say, living here in Australia, it's not just the developing world. It's been the same here in Australia. So the reason there's so much anti-Australia rhetoric coming from China is that China spent a lot of money buying Australian politicians. They spent a lot of money donating to Australian institutions. I mean, my own university, University of Sydney, has a Confucius Institute. It has a Chow Chok Wing Museum named after a Chinese Communist Party connected entrepreneur. You would take a lot of money from China, but then suddenly people get angry with China and all that money goes to waste. And I think it's been that story in Africa. Djibouti plays both sides. I mean, Djibouti has, because of its strategic position, Djibouti makes a fortune out of leasing bases to the United States, to China, to anyone who wants one, come to Djibouti and have a military base. So I don't think Djibouti is so much owned by China. Ethiopia was owned by China until 2 years ago. And now Chinese influence has been reduced almost to nothing.
Okay, thank you for the answer, sir. So there are another question, but now regarding European Super League. There are the problem of European Super League lately. Is it included?
I'm not sure I can answer this one, but go on.
Yeah. Is it included in liberal authoritarianism in sports or not? And what did Perez et al. Was a form of populism, or it was just a game of gamblers?
Look, I don't think we can reduce everything to politics, and I'm sure the European Super League was just an effort to make money on behalf of team owners who have these rights. But I'll tell you where we can see a liberal authoritarianism in sport is the International Olympic Committee. So consider the International Olympic Committee is only indirectly elected. I mean, it's elected, but it's elected through a very secret process where people lobby heads of athletic associations in different countries. It's not accountable to anybody. It's embraced a very, in some ways, a very liberal viewpoint, in that the International Olympic Committee is in favor of transgender athletes. It's in favor of promoting women in sport. It's in favor of gay pride. It's it's in favor of multiculturalism. So it has a very liberal agenda, but it is also very authoritarian in the sense that it uses the authority of the Olympic movement, kind of the branding, the fact that people accept the legitimacy of the Olympic movement. Like I said, authoritarianism requires both the politician and the populace accepting it. And because we accept the idea that a real gold medal is won from the Olympics. Now, why is an Olympic gold medal more important than a World Championship gold medal? Because we irrationally accept the authority of the Olympic movement to establish rules for sports. And so the International Olympic Committee is quite an authoritarian ruling body over sports. And as a result, it's able to work despite its liberal values. Despite embracing all these super liberal values, it can work with the Chinese Communist Party, not a problem. It can work with Putin's Russia, with Qatar, with the Gulf countries, not a problem.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So I think there is another question, sir. If there is no problem for you, is it okay?
I'm here all night. You told me 2 hours at least, so.
Okay, thank you. There is another question. I think this was for me. I'm just curious. Why do people always associate conspiracy theories with populism? Like, the 6th January attack on the Capitol building back then were associated with people who believe in conspiracy theories. Yeah.
Oh, conspiracy theories have always been part of populism. What are conspiracy theories? Conspiracy theories are unsupported, popular ideas that spread via word of mouth. So of course they're associated with populism. Think of something like the anti-vaccine movement. Every authority in the world World Health Organization, epidemiologists, your local doctor, every medical authority in the world tells you vaccines are safe. You should take your flu vaccine. You should get your DPT immunization shot. Yet, popular conspiracy theories abound, saying that no, this is all conspiracy by, it's a conspiracy by Western governments to sterilize Muslims. It's a conspiracy by Western governments to cause autism in our children. It's a conspiracy. So there are all sorts of conspiracy theories around vaccines. Same for all sorts of conspiracy theories. They, by their very nature, conspiracy theories are not subject to the endorsement of experts. If experts endorsed them, they wouldn't be conspiracy theories. As a result, they tend to be associated with populist movements. And we can even see this especially with the coronavirus outbreak, the theory that the coronavirus originated in the Wuhan virology lab. I was at an event last February, and someone in the audience raised this question for our panelists, and I ignored the question. The person in the audience, like February 15th of last year, and the person in the audience said, what about the theory that the lab was, that the virus actually originated in this virology lab? And as a authority, as a member of the expert class, I didn't take the question. I said to the panel, well, we don't know about that, but can you tell us what you think about the origin of the virus? That is, I didn't want to perpetuate the conspiracy theory. Move forward a year, I've been writing articles about the origin of the coronavirus in the Wuhan lab, because what was originally a conspiracy theory is now really, I think, the most likely theory for the origin of the virus. But it didn't spread through experts. It spread through popular networks of people talking about it, people promoting it. And eventually, when experts started looking at it, well, increasingly experts are saying, yeah, that actually looks like a credible explanation. So sometimes conspiracy theories can turn out to be true. But the point is, what makes them conspiracy theories, what connects them with populism, is that they're not spread through expert networks. That theory did not become a dominant theory because people went to conferences of the American Epidemiological Association and discussed it there. It became a leading theory because ordinary people spread it on the internet until it forced the experts to start taking it seriously.
Okay, thank you for the answer, sir. Now I'm gonna ask to the audience, is there any question? Kalau ada pertanyaan, bisa melalui room chat. Kalau misalnya dalam bahasa Indonesia, kalau dalam bahasa Inggris bisa langsung raise hand. Barangkali ada yang mau tanya. While waiting for another question, maybe I'm gonna ask you another one, sir. So in your book, in pages 102, you said that populism is a strategy of...
Now I have to go get the book.
Oh.
Yes. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh.
Yes, strategy of desperation.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Strategy of desperation.
Populism, so again, to use the coronavirus example, populism spreads, conspiracy theories spread, all of these sort of peer-to-peer communication spreads only when the established authorities are not taking people seriously. So there would have been no conspiracy theory spreading around the internet about the Wuhan virology lab if Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institutes of Health had announced a year ago that this is something we're investigating. People would have said, oh, all right, we're glad you're taking it seriously, you should investigate it. Populism, like conspiracy theories, spread when the authorities are not listening. So in America in 2016, people were not listening, the elites of America were not listening that ordinary Americans were upset about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, whether they were right to be upset or not is irrelevant. I mean, I myself wrote articles in favor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I wrote articles saying that it was quite reasonable for people to be nervous about it. But when they feel that experts are not taking them seriously, when they're just saying, no, we know what's best for you, we'll take care of things, when they're not listening, then the people themselves start spreading their own ideas. That's what populism is all about. So it's a strategy of desperation, because it means that they're not being given the opportunity to express their views in any other way. Populism doesn't just break out of nowhere. Populism breaks out when the established authorities refuse to listen. When the established authorities will not give people the choices they want, then we get populism.
Okay. Maybe there is.
I'll just, if I can piggyback on that, the original populism in the US was about the gold standard. In the US in the 1890s, there was a deflationary gold standard, and farmers were not able to pay their bills. And the farmers were saying, we need assistance, we need inflation, we need some form of, we need to go off the gold standard. And none of the politicians in Washington would listen. They all said, no, we know what's best for people. The gold standard is the only respectable thing to do. And so populism broke out, and William Jennings Bryan became the anti-gold standard candidate. And he lost, but it turned out 50 years later, now all economists agree that the gold standard was a terrible idea, that you can't have currencies linked to gold. Well, in 1890, that was a populist conspiracy theory that that the powers in Washington were trying to control the population using the gold standard. Now, everyone except now a few conspiracy theorists on the other side, everyone else accepts that the gold standard is ridiculous. But originally it was a populist conspiracy theory to get rid of the gold standard.
Okay. So, in another discussion, maybe there is something very new. This, what actually you called about? What do you mean by nativism, and what's the difference between nativism and protectionism, sir? That's
nativism is the idea that people who are already in a country should get greater privileges than foreigners or new immigrants. So, for example, if you have a policy that new immigrants to a country cannot access welfare benefits for 10 years, that's a very nativist approach. Or if you have a policy that all schools in Australia, for example, must be run in English. Yeah, it doesn't matter if your community speaks Chinese. Nope, we're Australia, we've decided it's English, you have to have school in English. Those are very nativist approaches. Nativism is not the same as protectionism. They're related, but nativism is about preference for the existing citizens or residents of a country. And nativism is usually associated with anti-immigrant opinions. So nativists tend to want low levels of immigration. Now, you can be a free trader. You can want no tariffs, but still be opposed to immigration. So if you want low tariffs, but you don't want immigrants, then you're a nativist, but you're not a protectionist. Now, again, these things often coincide. So very often, someone who's a nativist is also a protectionist. People say, we don't want immigration. We want America for Americans, Australia for Australians, Indonesia for Indonesians, and we want protective tariffs against foreign competition for our industries. Then you might be a nativist and a protectionist. And I think that's pretty common that the two go together. But I'll use this as an opportunity to point out that's neither left-wing nor right-wing, in that left-wing academics tend to oppose neoliberal policies like tariff reduction. So left-wing academics are protectionists, but they also tend to be not nativists, that they're in favor of immigration. So like, which one is, do these go together? Don't they? I think we should always think of each of these as its own separate issue. So nativism and protectionism often go together, but left-wing people often want tariffs and they don't like tariff reduction. So they're protectionists. Does that make them nativists? Probably not. Sometimes they are. These are each one of these dimensions is a separate dimension of its own, even if sometimes they coincide.
Oke, thank you. So, jadi ada yang mau tanya dari kawan-kawan? Belum ini mungkin? Kalau bisa raise hand yang mau tanya secara langsung dalam bahasa Inggris. Raise hand. Oh ya, ini ada yang mau tanya. Silakan.
Thank you for the chance. I'd like to ask, sorry, before you mentioned about but that populism means don't trust the authority, rely on your ability to seek information. It seems that social media will be the footing for the populists. I think I would like.
Sorry, that what is a footing?
Social media.
What is a footing for populists?
Social media.
So social media, yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
I'd like for you to elaborate that, because I think I see the possibility of it, but it's also a place where mass media and experts seek place to popularize their thought. So how populists actually can gather and make use of the information through social media to their benefit, since populism it can be a contender for authority in certain moments. Thank you.
Right. Social media certainly was a platform for populism, very much so in the lead up to the 2016 election. And many in the social media world celebrated that originally, the idea that social media allowed ordinary people to express their views and to spread their views. But then, of course, most social media owners, people like Mark Zuckerberg, very much opposed Donald Trump. And so they started to want to tighten the controls on social media to prevent social media being used for populist politics. So while social media with no controls certainly promotes populism, helps populism spread, social media companies have the ability to quash that. They can stop messages spreading if they want to. And social media, especially YouTube and Facebook, over the last few years, have really given preference in their algorithms to established media sources. So whereas 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been much easier for an ordinary person to spread a meme on Facebook or to have a highly successful political video on YouTube. Now, both companies prefer to penalize ordinary users while promoting the videos of established corporate users. That said, they may be successful in doing this, or it might just lead to the rise of new social media outlets. So we're seeing this with in the US, the new voice sharing app, whose name I'm forgetting, but we're seeing new social media apps arise. Ku in India has arisen as a response to the political repression that goes on Twitter. We saw Parler in the United States until it was put out of business by Amazon. Essentially, Amazon refused to host its servers. So we're seeing, as social media companies try to control their media, they become less social. That is, YouTube is not a social media channel if YouTube decides that the only content creators are Disney, Disney and Sony and such. Well, once YouTube does that, YouTube just becomes another Netflix, and the videos will go somewhere else. That is, user-created content will go somewhere else. It's a constant, cat and mouse fight between the social media companies and the populists. I don't know who will win. Certainly, social media companies have limited the spread of populism in recent years. Whether that will result in those platforms disappearing because they're no longer open, I don't know.
Okay, thank you for the answer, sir. So, ada lagi pertanyaan dari kawan-kawan? Mungkin langsung raise hand aja kalau mau langsung dalam bahasa Inggris. Kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia bisa chat via chat Zoom. Mungkin maybe I would like to question again if it is okay, sir. So,
yeah, all yours.
Okay. So you are talking about contemporary international law is in one sense no law at all, since there is no international sovereign to legislate it. So what actually you mean by international sovereign to legislate it? Because we see that there are European Union, ASEAN, and something like that. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. I will state categorically, there is no such thing as international law. The term international law is used by legal scholars who would like to create a body of international law. But the early theorists of international law in the 19th century, early 20th century, were very clear on this, that there's no international law because there is no legitimate authority to legislate for the world. So what we call international law is really just a confluence of national laws. So for example, if you want to join the European Union, you have to implement the European Union acquis communautaire into your national law, so that European Union legislation or European Union regulations become Croatian national law, Italian national law, Greek national law, French national law, because only Croatia, Greece, Italy can actually enforce the law. Similarly, when there's an international treaty between two countries, in the United States, a treaty becomes domestic law. So if the US signs a treaty with somebody, that treaty has the force of law in the United States. I don't know how other countries treat international treaties, but in the United States, it becomes domestic law. The domestic law exists, but there's no such thing as international law, meaning that if the US has an agreement with China, for example, the US and China signed this phase 2 trade deal last January, a little over a year ago, in January 2020, no one can enforce that. World Trade Organization has a set of rules. Nobody can enforce them. China breaks World Trade Organization rules all the time. China can get away with breaking World Trade Organization rules because nobody can punish China enough to change its behavior. If, however, Cambodia were to violate World Trade Organization rules, it's very easy to punish Cambodia. Cambodia is small, vulnerable. It's easy to punish it by putting tariffs on on Cambodian exports. But because China is a big country, it just ignores what it said in the World Trade Organization. I mean, China actually said in 1999, when it joined the World Trade Organization, it said that it would provide 100% liberalization of its finance and electronic communications market, so internet and finance, by 2009, within 10 years. It's 2021. China still hasn't allowed its internet to be opened up to everybody. It still hasn't allowed its banks to be opened up. I mean, in theory, international banks should have been allowed to operate in China freely, just like domestic banks, since 2009, according to international law. But it's not a law because it's not enforceable. It's simply an agreement. International law is simply what countries have said they will do, but they have no obligation to do so. Now, you have an obligation to obey the law. If you don't obey the law, they'll put you in jail. Nobody puts countries in jail for disobeying what they've agreed.
Okay, thank you for your information and your explanation, sir. So, jadi ada kawan-kawan yang mau tanya, saya persilakan. Ada pertanyaan bahasa Indonesia bisa lewat chat, kalau raise hand langsung menyampaikan dalam bahasa Inggris. Pertanyaannya sudah habis untuk sementara. Kalau ada yang mau menyampaikan lagi, silakan. Tidak ada ya? Okay. I think there are no other questions, sir. So would you mind to give us a closing statement before we close this discussion?
Before we close, what I'd really like to hear is something about what's going on in Indonesian politics and why you think any of this is relevant to Indonesia. And if anybody, I mean, not just you, but if anybody could chime in on that, what is the relevance of all of this to Indonesia? I'm very curious to hear it.
Okay. Maybe the interesting part, or the part related to Indonesia in your book, was about the populism, especially after, you know, Fediadis from Melbourne University talk about Islamic populism. But I think, from my perspective, what you said about populism are more relevant because it is not, you know, do not have any tendency towards any place, you know. So the most relatable was about the populism and about, you know, how people are trying to challenge the expert nowadays because, you know, in Indonesia there are a lot of hoax, you know, people even saying in the television hoax like that. So that's why I think this is very relevant, you know. And Trump was a global phenomenon. Even in Indonesia, several academics watch about the election in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, 2014 and 2019, you know, and they make this kind of, what did you call it? Prediction about who's gonna win. Even someone predict that Bernie Sanders will win. He was a great man.
He could have. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other insights on Indonesian politics that anyone wants to share before we wrap up?
Ramadan, Farita lagi.
May I add? I think there is this part when you mention about populism doesn't really have wings, and well, I couldn't agree more because there is this mass movement which sparked the research of Edi Hadis. It was 212 when the Muslim gathered to seek justice about Ahok, and it was, I think it was when I see that no matter how religious a person, or even they're not religious at all, but when they went on the basis of religion, disregard whether they're religious or not, they able to move, they able to gather. And it was, I think it was the first time in Indonesia it was ever happened. And also it there's something that catch my attention when you mentioned about the new authoritarianism. It was on the hand of think tank, Wall Street top leader of corporation, and how the ministry in this new cabinet is quite out of ordinary, I'd say, because there are many young people. We even have a Ministry of Education that was originally started in business and founded Gojek, a big corporation, a big startup in Indonesia, and it was something new in Indonesia. And I perceived that he was an expert in his own field, business, but he came to education, a Minister of Education. It's something that is quite new, but he also has advantage that he's quite popular, and also there is this special staff of the president. They consist of young people, and it was often emphasized that this government has many millennials to help the country. I think that's where it relates with Indonesia in one way or another. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for the education. Does anyone else want to make a point?
Ada lagi, Sulkan, Yusuf, Ramadan, sama kawan-kawan yang tanya tadi, mungkin bisa memberi insight kepada Profesor Babones tentang apa yang terjadi di Indonesia. Sekarang zamannya internasional, ya, jadi upayakan kita semua untuk mulai belajar bahasa Inggris bersama. Buku left-wing populisme itu harusnya jangan diterjemahkan. Nanti banyak orang yang yang nggak mau baca bahasa Inggrisnya akhirnya. Gitu. Mungkin kawan-kawan ada lagi? Ramadan.
Right. So is that it then?
I think there are no more people who would comment. So.
Okay. Then Reza, thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to everyone for attending. If I would leave you with a message, it's to be specific in your political insults. If you want to criticize somebody, criticize them for what they've done.
Okay.
and realize that every insult is not the same. And to just make sure you're using using descriptions and words in as much a technical way as you can, because it helps clarify thinking. It helps make everything much more accurate. It raises the level of debate, because instead of just saying, I don't like this person, you're saying, I don't like this person because, and then giving really valid criticisms that then can convince people why your criticisms are meaningful. And not to use words like authoritarianism or totalitarianism or populism just as generic left-wing, right-wing, all of these terms, not to use them as generic insults for people you don't like, but instead to argue with their specific policies with which you oppose, and then of course present a positive alternative, which is really what we're after in a democracy.
Okay, thank you very much for the closing statement. So maybe this is the answer, because there are no other questions, because in Indonesia the people here wasn't like in Malaysia. We are not used to speak in English, only several. Even I cannot speak it fluently. I'm very sorry if there is something wrong with my, English.
I don't speak any Indonesian, so thank you very much for speaking English for my benefit.
Okay. Thank you very much for attending the discussion. I'm very sorry if I'm bothering you on the evening, sir. So, thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Take care, everyone.
Take care, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.